When talking about the Stalingrad Airlift, you often hear how the Luftwaffe based their ability to supply 6th Army by air on their success at Demyansk. But what you often hear is that at Demyansk, that was just 100,000 men, whereas 6th Army was nearly 3 times that number, so it's obvious they couldn't supply it. What they don't tell you is that they actually managed to airlift a lot more supplies to Demyansk than they did to Stalingrad. And I mean, a lot more. And there's only 11 days difference between the two airlifts. Yes, different times of the year, but both were in cold conditions, and the Stalingrad's resupply airfields were actually closer to the Stalingrad pocket than the Demyansk airfields were to Demyansk. So the question is, if they could supply this many tons at Demyansk, why couldn't they supply at least this many tons to Stalingrad? Because technically they should have been able to. It's not a question of if the Luftwaffe failed at Stalingrad. We know that they failed, there's no getting around that. But it's a question of how badly did they fail and what was the reason for this failure. So what we're going to do is this. We'll give you the context of the Stalingrad Airlift, then take a look at the requirements for 6th Army. We'll look at how many planes they had and how many sorties they conducted, and we'll look at the supply prioritization for the 6th Army, look at the ration situation and so on, and then compare Demyansk to Stalingrad and summarize. In the pinned comment in the comment section below, you will find timestamps to various parts of the video, as well as sources, extra notes, and a link to my Patreon page. So please consider supporting me on Patreon and make more of these videos possible. Okay, let's dive in. On the 23rd of November 1942, somewhere in the region of 270,000 Axis troops were caught in the pocket of Stalingrad. Luftwaffe Chief Jesenek indicates to Hitler that the German Air Force could supply the trapped troops of 6th Army by air, just as they'd done at Demyansk earlier in the year. Even though this was just an indication, Hitler's mind is made up and orders the Luftwaffe to figure out the details. His intention, though, is to send Field Marshal Manstein to the area and relieve 6th Army as soon as possible. So the airlift is only really meant to be a temporary thing. When Goering does the math, being incredibly conscious of the fact that Hitler's mind has already been made up, and Goering finds out that it was impossible to meet the full requirements of 6th Army, he boldly announces that they could meet the minimum requirements. Of course, though, they actually have some reason to think they could do it. They managed to do this at Demyansk early in the year, and the 300 tons required at Demyansk matched the minimum required at Stalingrad. So, if they could do it then, they could probably do it now. The Stalingrad Airlift lasts 71 days from the 23rd of November 1942 to the 2nd of February 1943. Technically, they do drop supplies on the 3rd of February, but at this point they're pretty much feeding the Soviets, since 6th Army had surrendered. The Luftwaffe's resupply effort has always been seen as a failure by historians, with many citing things like the terrible weather, the lack of transport planes, the distance between the airfields and the Soviet Air Force were there as well, as all reasons for this failure. And that's fine, we'll get to those points shortly. But first, what we need to figure out is what were the requirements at Stalingrad. The 6th Army requested 750 tons per day in order to be fully supplied. They said they could get by with 500 tons per day and could subsist at 300 tons. Glantz says that the subsistence level meant the absolute minimum necessary for subsistence and did not include all the materials necessary to maintain a fighting force. So the question becomes, how many planes would it take to supply this force? Well, in theory, a Ju-52 bomber can carry between 1.5 and 2 tons each. To subsist then, 150 Ju-52s would be required. To get by, 250 Ju-52s would be required. And to fully supply the 6th Army, 375 Ju-52s would be required. But that is 352 Ju-52s flying into the pocket. That does not include Ju-52s sitting back at base being loaded, repaired, or having crews rested and because they're exhausted and so on. At a 30% readiness rate, the Luftwaffe would need 1,050 Ju-52s to fully supply the 6th Army. The Luftwaffe on a whole only had 750 Ju-52s, so even if they 100% commit all of these, they would only just about supply 6th Army's get-by needs. A third of these 750 Ju-52s were supporting the Tunisian operation, and more were actually still committed at Demyansk, which was still needing to be resupplied by air, even though it had actually been linked up on the ground. At most, the Luftwaffe committed 500 transport aircraft to the Stalingrad operation. However, 500 transports was the number they had at Demyansk. So again, if they have 500 aircraft in both operations, you'd think they'd be delivering similar numbers of supplies in both operations. The distance between the airfields and the Stalingrad pockets was 200 to 230 kilometers, so roughly a 55-minute flight. It was a 90-minute flight to Demyansk from their resupply airfields, so again, a shorter flight time for Stalingrad. Looking at the raw data, the Luftwaffe should have been able to supply 6th Army's subsistence level of 300 tons per day. In many historical accounts, the reason the Luftwaffe doesn't have a chance of supplying 6th Army is because of the lack of transport planes to conduct the airlift. And that's fine, they barely had enough to supply the minimum needs of the 6th Army. 500 planes with 150 operational delivering 300 tons. What these accounts don't tell you is that the Luftwaffe failed even with the planes they had. They never once supplied the minimum amount on any of the days, even though they had enough planes. Now, they didn't have enough planes at the beginning, that much is true. According to David Glantz, the Luftwaffe had 47 aircraft ready to begin the airlift on day one. On day one then, they sent out 29, which is 61.7%. On the second day of December, they had 200 aircraft and sent out none because of the weather. But the next day they sent out 85, which is 43.5%. On the 8th of December, they have 300 aircraft and send out 43, which is 14.3%. And the next day they send out 97, which is 32%. By mid-December, they have enough planes. They have around 500, and in theory should have been hitting the minimum requirements, because even at a rate of 30% operational efficiency, which is 150 planes, these could deliver 300 tons-ish. But they simply don't achieve this. Now, we'll come back to the tonnages in a bit. For now, let's focus on the number of aircraft they put into the sky. Okay, here's a fact. On the 71 days of the airlift, they never once sent out 150 planes. Not once. In fact, it's worse than that. Take a look at this chart. Out of the 71 days of the airlift, they only managed to send out 100 planes on 12 of the days. That's 16.9%. 28 of the days they send out between 50 and 100 aircraft. That's 39.4%, and less than 50 planes take off on 31 of the days of the 79-day airlift. That's 43.7%. Almost half of the days they didn't actually send out 50 aircraft. This is a big problem. From mid-December, they have enough planes to put out 150 per day, and they never do this. Okay, maybe they didn't quite have enough, but even then, they're simply not getting enough into the sky. Take a look at this chart. This chart represents the number of planes sent out between the 19th of December 1942 and the 2nd of February 1943. Out of this 46-day period, a period where they had roughly 500 planes, they sent out less than 50 planes on 37% of the days. They sent less than 50 planes out to resupply the 6th Army. On 41.3% of the days, they managed between 50 and 100 planes. Again, this is a period where they had 500 planes. They certainly have more than 300, yet 78.3% of the time, they don't even get 100 planes into the sky. This is less than a 30% operational efficiency. This is much less than that. At Stalingrad, it is not just about a lack of planes. It is the Luftwaffe's inability to operate the planes they already have. They are simply not putting enough planes that they do actually have into the sky. What is the reason for this? Is it because they don't have enough ground crews or enough heating equipment? Is it bad weather, or is it a lack of management, or even is it bad management? Is it a lack of aviation fuel? Is it a combination of all these factors? Probably. But it isn't a case of we don't have enough planes. No, they had enough planes, they just didn't operate the ones they had. What is the result of the inability of the Luftwaffe to put the planes they do have into the sky? Let's take a look at this graph. This is the number of supplies that reached 6th Army divided into the tons they managed on each day. 21.1% of the time, the Luftwaffe delivered less than 50 tons of supplies to the 6th Army. That's 1/6 of the absolute minimum number of supplies needed just to subsist. This is 1/6 of the needs of the Demyansk pocket. And 21.1% of the time, a fifth of the time, this is all they managed. 38% of the time, they managed to deliver 50 to 100 tons of supplies. That's a third. And if you combine this number with the number of days they delivered less than 50 tons, that's 59.1%. That's 59.1% of the time that the Luftwaffe couldn't even manage to supply a third of the absolute minimum required at Stalingrad and or Demyansk. This was less than a third of what was expected in both those airlifts. 100 to 150 tons is another massive 25.4%, another huge portion, and a lot of these days they didn't even get anywhere near 150 tons. If you add it all up, you'll find that 84.5% of the time the Luftwaffe could not supply half of the absolute minimum requirements, less than half of what was expected at Demyansk as well, 84.5% of the time. Add up the remainder, 150 to 200 tons and 200 plus or more tons, and you'll see that 100% of the time, the Luftwaffe failed to meet the absolute minimum requirements. Now, these numbers are based on the numbers coming from the official German history of the war, because some sources do say they actually hit the minimum on some of the days. But either way, though, this is a complete and utter failure on behalf of the Luftwaffe. And, well, we already knew that, but the point to take away is that this is just bad. The extent of the failure is huge. For 59.1% of the time, they're not even delivering a third of the minimum. And 84.5% of the time, they're not delivering half of the minimum. If this had been Demyansk, this would have been a failure as well. But what were they delivering? If we take a look at this chart here, this is each day of the airlift between the 23rd of November 1942 and the 12th of January 1943. After this, the individual stats aren't given, only the totals, so I've left them out. Each full bar represents the total number of tons delivered that day. Ammunition is in red, food is in yellow, fuel is in purple, and other supplies are the light blue specks on top of some of the bars. Now, notice that in the first few weeks, really almost the first month, most of the supplies coming into the 6th Army are fuel and ammunition. Up until the big yellow bar right in the centre, which is the 19th of December, and happens to be the most supplies the 6th Army ever receive in a single day throughout the whole of the airlift, the priority for the whole of this part is fuel and ammunition. Only after this point are fuel supplies given a priority. Now, it's made out by some historians to be a terrible thing that they weren't getting food during this early stage. Talking about the first week of the airlift, Beaver writes, just 350 tonnes arrived during the course of the whole week. Out of this 350 tonnes, there were only 14 tonnes of food for a ration strength by then reduced to 275,000. 3/4 of the load consisted of fuel, of which part was for the Luftwaffe's own aircraft based at Pitomnik, to protect the transport aircraft from Russian fighters. In the second week, up to 6th of December, 512 tonnes, still less than a quarter of the minimum, arrived, delivered by an average of 44 transport aircraft a day. Only 24 tonnes were food supplies. More and more draft animals had to be slaughtered to make up the shortage. Soldiers saw their rations diminishing rapidly, but they convinced themselves that the situation would not last. Beaver, and others as well, imply that the Luftwaffe, or the guys in charge of the airlift, weren't supplying the 6th Army correctly. And between the lines, he's critical of the lack of food being delivered. Now, I don't want to criticise Beaver too much, because I get moaned at every time I do. But the reason 6th Army didn't get supplied with food at this point is because they didn't order any. They didn't need the food at this point. In fact, Paulus had agreed not to request food until they'd slaughtered their horses and were out of their normal rations, which, according to Glantz, they had 6 days worth of full rations when the pocket closed on the 23rd of November. Rations were reduced so they could continue with what they had for at least 2 or 3 weeks. It wasn't nice for the men, but they could actually do this. But why would they do that? Surely priority is food and then ammunition, right? Well, no. The priority at this point, this beginning bit, was breaking out. So fuel and ammunition was what was needed. If Paulus had been given the order to break out at this stage, and if they'd got back to friendly lines, well, they wouldn't need rations at all at this point. They would have gone hungry for a few days, but they could have survived that. So suggesting that this was the Luftwaffe's fault for not supplying the 6th Army with food in the first few weeks is not correct. Obviously, they should have been supplying everything at this point, but with the lack of aircraft at this stage, they hadn't built up enough yet, prioritising fuel and ammunition was the correct decision, and the 6th Army simply wasn't ordering much food at this point. As you see, pretty much from the 26th of December onwards, food now becomes the priority. Ammunition is neglected almost completely for food and then a little fuel. So what changed this priority? It was the failure of Operations Winter Tempest and Thunderclap, the relief and breakout attempts. Manstein is trying to break into Stalingrad with a relief force, Operation Winter Tempest or Winter Storm, depending on the translation. He's got 2 pincers attacking towards Stalingrad, or at least he would have if the northern pincer wasn't fighting for its life, fighting the Soviets who were themselves attacking. So the northern pincer doesn't actually pince, but the second pincer does, and is making its way towards Stalingrad. Paulus is willing to break out and has prepared Operation Thunderclap, or Donnerschlag in German, which is his breakout plan. On the 18th of December, Paulus speaks to Manstein, giving him 3 possibilities of breaking out. Case 1. To break out through Buzinovka to meet Hoth is possible only with tanks, since the infantry force is lacking, and therefore holding Stalingrad and the long new flanks risky. With this solution, the fortress loses all reserves with which to clean up further break-ins. Case 2. Breakout without connecting with Hoth only in the most extreme emergency. The loss of much equipment must be taken into consideration. This assumes the prior flying in of sufficient food and fuel. The combat capability of the men must be improved first. If Hoth only temporarily makes contact and brings in vehicles, this solution will be easier. The infantry divisions are currently almost immovable, and it would get worse every day as horses need to be constantly slaughtered. Case 3. Continue holding current position depends on supply and flying in sufficient manpower. Up to now, supply has been completely inadequate. Based on the current situation, further holding is no longer possible. Yes, this was the 18th of December. They held out until February. Notice that they still have horses, and also note the reason the infantry divisions were immovable is because of their heavy equipment, not because they were hungry. They're slaughtering a lot of their horses and so don't have anything to pull their big guns or heavy equipment. Paulus is saying here that they're going to lose a lot of equipment in the breakout attempt because his men would be leaving their artillery and big guns behind. This is actually the best option because it's obvious to Manstein now that Hoth won't be breaking into Stalingrad. Paulus and Manstein exchange some questions and answers. Manstein: when is the earliest Case 2 can begin? Paulus: preparation time 3 to 4 days. Manstein: how much fuel and how much food is necessary? Paulus: 1.5 fuel loads according to Senior Quartermaster Don. Short rations for approximately 10 days from 270,000 men. Manstein: provisionally, the previous orders stand. At 2300 hours, call again. Notice that throughout this entire exchange, there's no mention of ammunition, and this is reflected in the supply situation. Ammunition drops, but food is now becoming an issue. Paulus needs 10 days worth of rations in order to attempt the breakout, and he gets 3 days worth. This is in fact the best 3 days the Luftwaffe can give him throughout the entire airlift. Interestingly, according to David Glanst, by midday on the 23rd of December, any hope of Manstein getting to Paulus had vanished. This is then reflected in the supply situation. 2 days of no deliveries, and then food, and then some fuel. At this point, it becomes a matter of keeping the 6th Army alive because, well, there's no hope for a relief or breakout attempt from now on. When you hear that 6th Army has no ammunition left towards the end, yep, no wonder. The point to take away from this, though, is that the 6th Army doesn't need food at the beginning, it just needs fuel and ammunition, again, for its breakout or relief attempt. There's a bit of a crossover during the relief attempt where 6th Army runs out of food, but once Manstein has failed, food becomes the absolute priority. And the Luftwaffe simply failed to deliver. Sources vary here, but we're going to give it a go anyway. The bread ration went from the full 16 ounces, 450 grams, to 8 ounces, 225 grams on the 23rd of November. Then, on the 7th of December, the bread ration is cut to 200 grams, 7 ounces a day. By the 26th of December, the bread ration is cut to less than 60 grams, 2 ounces a day. Basically, 2 or 3 slices of bread. They're given some meat, usually horse meat, and some fat as well, but essentially these are in decline as well. So at this point, they were given less than a quart of vegetable soup at midday, and either tinned food or a second bowl of soup in the evening. To put this into perspective, soldiers at Leningrad during the siege of the winter of 1941 to 1942 got 8 ounces a day, and the rest of the population got 4. This led to people eating cats, dogs, birds' wallpaper, glue, leather. They cut limbs off corpses and they resorted to cannibalism. The food levels had dropped that low for the 6th Army, so it certainly wasn't comfortable for the soldiers. Horse meat has become rare. Besides, one can't eat it raw. There's no firewood in the middle of the steppe. I hope things will change soon. On the 21st of December, Paulus reported the first deaths from starvation. These were listed as death from exhaustion in the official reports. There was also a lice epidemic, and there's even a tale of a man's frozen foot being eaten by rats during the night, and then him not noticing until morning because he was frozen. During the last week of December, Paulus realised that his army could no longer physically break out, even if it had wanted to, because, well, its men were so weak from hunger. After the 28th of January, the drastic measure was taken to not give food to the wounded or sick in order to keep the fighters alive. And cannibalism had become a thing by this point, at least for the 3,500 Soviet prisoners of war interned at the POW camps inside the pocket. When they were liberated by advancing Soviet troops, only about 30 had survived. These were terrible conditions, and it was as a direct result of the decision to hold on and the failure of the Luftwaffe to supply the army. The 100,000 men of 2nd Army Corps trapped at Demyansk had required no less than 300 tons of supplies per day. Because of low operational rates caused by winter conditions, the Luftwaffe had been forced to commit almost 500 Ju-52s to the airlift in order to ensure that sufficient planes, around 150, could carry that tonnage each day. So instantly, just looking at the raw numbers, the Luftwaffe committed as many planes to Demyansk as they did to Stalingrad. 500 planes. Both needed to supply 300 tons. 300 tons is what the men at Demyansk needed to fight fully. At Stalingrad, the number for 300 tons was the subsistence level required for the army, not enough to keep it fighting, but just subsist. So again, in theory, if the Luftwaffe could commit the same number of planes at Stalingrad as they did at Demyansk, they could actually supply 300 tons per day. At Demyansk, the airlift supplied the pockets from the 12th of February until the 5th of May 1942. In that 82-day period, they conducted 14,455 air transport sorties into the pockets, and in total, 24,303 tons of supplies and equipment were flown in. At Stalingrad, the total air sorties were 4,406, and these delivered 6,536.3 tons of supplies. Take a look at this chart. The blue is Demyansk, the red is Stalingrad. The number of sorties is significantly less for Stalingrad, and thus the number of tons supplied is also significantly less. Yes, the Stalingrad airlift was 11 days shorter, but the distance of the flight to Stalingrad was shorter as well, 55 minutes to 90 minutes at Demyansk. So it's not really about that. The point is that a similar number of aircraft were committed in both operations, and yet at Stalingrad they did not fly. In theory, they should have delivered to Stalingrad at least 3 times the amount they actually did. I think we can conclude that at Stalingrad, the Luftwaffe were not operating anywhere near as well as they could have done, with disastrous consequences for the 6th Army. Was it the weather? Was it the commanders? Was it Richthofen? Was it Fiebig? Was it somebody else? Was it the lack of aircraft? Not quite. Are you ready to find out what it was? Why did the Luftwaffe fail at Stalingrad? They had similar numbers of planes compared to Demyansk. The weather was similar to Demyansk. The airfields were actually closer than Demyansk, and yet they couldn't supply the 300 tons per day at Stalingrad as they had done during Demyansk. Why? Above all else, one factor changed between Demyansk and Stalingrad, and that factor was the Red Army and the Red Air Force. By their own estimates, the Germans lost 125 transport aircraft at Demyansk, and this pales in comparison to the 488 aircraft lost during the Battle of Stalingrad. Most of these, 266, are Ju-52s. They only had 750 in total, and so they had just lost 35% of their Ju-52s during the Battle of Stalingrad. They're being shot down in increasing numbers. The Red Army places anti-aircraft guns along the entire flight path. They're hit when they land on the airfields with artillery, bearing in mind Voronov is the guy in charge of the Red Army units now surrounding Stalingrad, and he's an artillery guy, so he brings a ton of artillery and mortars to bear on the Germans. And the Red Army Air Force is no longer the flying circus it was during the first weeks of 1941. It had been completely obliterated during Operation Barbarossa, but much like the Red Army Air Force had recovered and was now beginning to bite back. General Wolfgang Pickert's 9th Flak Division sits on the airfields inside the Stalingrad pocket. Pickert gathers all the anti-aircraft guns he can find to keep the Soviet Air Force off from Pitomnik airfield. The enemy appeared often with 6 to 10 aircraft, dropping bombs and strafing. It was at times rather awe-inspiring, and although there was little damage, there were unfortunately a few losses. 2 Ju-52s were also shot down, fully laden with fuel. As early as the 24th of November, Richthofen writes in his diary, "The air supply of Stalingrad suffers under the influence of Russian fighters. We are forced to leave fighters inside the pocket, therefore, although they themselves consume part of the supplies needed by 6th Army. They are not yet able to guarantee the security of the supply operation, and the Russians can still sweep over our forward airfield in the pocket at any time." Now, it has been noted by some historians that Soviet kill claims are exaggerated, but we also know that German records understate their own losses. They don't report damaged tanks as losses if they're being repaired, even though these had already been knocked out. Same applies to the German aircraft. They may have had hundreds of aircraft, but as we know, they never put 150 into the sky, and these numbers dropped as the airlift continued. This is blamed on the weather, which certainly played its part, but let's not forget that transports are flying over Soviet anti-aircraft guns, and they're being hit by Soviet fighters at a time when, well, there wasn't enough German escorts. The Soviets don't need to bring down a transport, they just need to render it inoperable. If they damage a Ju-52 enough so that it's sat in a repair shop for a week, that's as good as a kill. The Germans claim 488 transport losses, the Soviets claim 903, which is way too high. But I suspect this includes damaged aircraft, which the Germans aren't listing. Either way, the Germans are losing their transports at a much higher rate than they did during the Demyansk pocket, losing nearly 500 planes at a time when they were meant to have had 500 planes. Yes, the Germans blame the weather, snow, blizzards and anything else, but they suffered through this the previous winter. The difference now was that they had the Red Army Air Force to contend with. This is the reason that the Luftwaffe cannot put enough planes into the sky, and why the supply of the 6th Army fails. The Red Army now have enough equipment they didn't have just 6 months earlier. The factories that had been evacuated to the Urals were now online, and the men were receiving tanks, mortars, anti-aircraft guns, planes. As Hayward points out, the Luftwaffe was stopped at Stalingrad, and it wasn't just because of the weather. They couldn't even supply what they'd achieved at Demyansk. The 6th Army starved, and the Luftwaffe never fully recovered. Now, just like the 6th Army, I cannot make these videos without supplies. The statistics, facts and quotes, these come from books, and I need your support in order to make more of these videos happen. So please consider supporting me on Patreon. Links are going to be in the description and the pinned comment. And thank you very much to my current patrons for supporting me. As always, you guys are awesome. The question I want to leave you all with is this. If the Luftwaffe had delivered 300 tons a day, would the breakout attempt have happened? Would it have been possible for Paulus to attempt to break out of the pocket in December 1942? We'll explore the breakout questions in a future video, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.